combined Millerite history with our reform lane. We saw that 2014 is the midway point between two dates, 9/11 and 2019, April 19 and October 22. So when we think of what brought us to 2014, it was primarily the 126 and the 151. So the 2520 is 2 times the 1260. And it was identified that from the 2520, using the many tekel ufasen, you could calculate it equaling the 126 and the 151. And then I believe it's also well established in the public record. The same way you divide the 2520 into 2 periods of 1260, what can you do to the 126? Into 2 periods of what? To 2 periods of 63 years. To follow this thought, we're going to primarily use these two. I want us to understand the 151 and the 63. If we use the 151, it takes us to the midpoint in a period of history, bookended by the beginning and the end of the Civil War. In 1861, there's a call by the religious organisations, the Protestant churches, to place a religious inscription on their currency. The reason that they are making this call now and that is for the first time accepted is because there is a national crisis. And they believe that the nation is under the judgment of God. 1863, the phrase is decided. In God we trust. 1864 becomes official, it begins to be stamped. 1865, an act of Congress places this on all the new coins that will bear its inscription. There's another event that we take to 1863. What's that? What else were they doing in this history? So it gets 1861, 1862, what's happening between the Republicans and the Democrats? Who's winning? The Democrats are winning. So what are the Republicans going to do? They start to panic. February of 1863, this is A.T. Jones. February of 1863, there was begun an organised movement by a religious combination composed of the evangelical churches of the country to get the government of the United States committed by direct legislation to a recognition of the Christian religion and a national adoption and enforcement of Sunday as the Christian Sabbath or the Lord's Day. They proposed first to accomplish their purpose by an amendment to the national constitution, declaring this to be a Christian nation, and so placing all Christian laws, institutions and usages upon an undeniable legal basis in the fundamental law of the land. So this is this organised movement by a religious combination composed of evangelical churches. And what was that organisation called? This is the beginning of the national reform movement. This is the movement that A.T. Jones and our pioneers fought all in the history that's still coming. All the way through 1888, 1893, it's the national reform movement. And they begin in 1863. I want us to read, this is, you'll find this on the Ellen White site online, WEGW. 120.1.1 and 2. Early in 1863, the Civil War had not been going well for the North. That's what we just discussed. The Democrats are winning. Distressed over the terrible disaster his troops had suffered at Fredericksburg in December, General Burnside had just stepped down as commander of the Army of the Potomac. Interpreting the Union defeats as a manifestation of divine wrath, clergymen representing 11 Protestant denominations met in Ohio on February 4 of 1863, seeking ways to appease an angry God. So they see the defeat of the Republican side as a manifestation of God's wrath. They seek ways to appease God's anger. They meet in Ohio and they form the National Reform Association. Why was God angry with the United States? According to the association's spokesman, the reason was the failure of the government to acknowledge the lordship of Jesus Christ and to enforce his moral law. Even after the war was over and the North had won, they retained their conviction that Jehovah was displeased with America. National reformers continued to warn for at least the next 3 decades that divine judgment threatened the United States. And that's what they continued through the 1890s, that our pioneers were fighting. So they see the defeat of the Union as a manifestation of God's anger, and they're trying to find ways to appease an angry God. So you have 2 streams of information in this history. One is Ellen White. One is the Protestant churches. Both see the Civil War as the judgment of God. Why does Ellen White say it's being judged? Slavery. They've had 63 years since the nation rose up as a lamb-like beast, 63 years of probationary time to deal with the issue of slavery. And have they done it? No. The South has refused to buckle and the North has compromised. The Protestant churches, why are they saying it's under the judgment of God? Because they say we haven't recognised a Christian nation and we haven't enforced the moral law. 2 different streams of information dealing with the same event. And who does Ellen White say God is particularly angry with? Who is the main focus point of God's anger?
The North.
What about the North? What in the North? His anger burns against this nation and especially against the religious bodies who've sanctioned slavery. Who's his focus? Who's he most angry with? It's the Protestants. It's the Protestant churches, the same ones bringing about the national reform movement. They don't realise that they're the reason the nation's being judged. They think it's all the immoral people, all the atheists. So 1861 to 65, what I want us to particularly see is this phrase, "In God we trust," and what happens in 1863, what famous battle? This is the Battle of Gettysburg, and what begins to happen? The tide turns. It's here that the tide turns. Here it's the South that's winning. At the Battle of Gettysburg, it turns. And what does Abraham Lincoln say in the Gettysburg Address? What does he introduce into the Pledge of Allegiance? Particular phrase. We have "In God we trust," and there's another phrase.
One nation under God.
Under God. You declare the Pledge of Allegiance, you're making allegiance to the nation under God. It's in that speech. So we get to 1863. What's 1861 on our reform line? On our reform line, where would we put 1861? (9/11). It's April 19. 1863. 1865. How do we make 1865 2019? Because you can't do it with a number, you have to do it with a structure. So 1863 is the midpoint in the Civil War. 2014 is a midpoint. Midway between the tarrying of the bridegroom and the shut door. Can we see that? So we've taken the principle of the midpoint. If we were to go to Millerite history, it's April 19, July 21, October 22. I just want us to note one other date in this history. So 1865 becomes 2019 because we're bookending 1863. But if we're going to use the 151 to 2019, what do we take? 1868. It also comes down to 2019. And what happened in 1868? You have the issue of slavery in this history. What's the issue in 1868? The 14th and 15th Amendments gave rights to freed slaves. But what did they do in the 14th and 15th Amendment? What did they introduce into the Constitution? Male pronouns. So in 1868, they placed the 14th and 15th Amendments to the Constitution. It gives rights to freed slaves, but they need to make sure that black women don't think that that gave them the right to vote. So they have to make it specific. It gives black men the right to vote, but they have to demonstrate that the black women were not also going to receive that vote. This is the beginning of the women's suffrage movement. The insertion of the word male into the Constitution and the enfranchisement of African American men presented new challenges for women's rights activists. For the first time, the Constitution asserted that men, not women, had the right to vote. Previously, only state laws restricted voting rights to men. Elizabeth Cady Stanton wrote, "If that word male be inserted, it will take us a century at least to get it out." And the women's suffrage movement began. There's one other event here that's not related to this story, but that we've already noted. 1868 is the first of 2 impeachments in US history. Because you had a new president. Abraham Lincoln had died, and this new president, whose side was he on? He was on the side of the South. You have a president in 1868 who's trying to benefit the South and restrict freedom for slaves. This is the history of the 151. I'll make more room. Let's consider the 63. If we go back 63 years from 2014, where does it take us? 1951. And we have to see 1951 must therefore be a midway point. There's an interesting, if you do look up this, some sources, there's an interesting New York Times article that's titled, "A Christian Nation Since When?" And what they do in this article is they show how this concept that the United States is a Christian nation has been introduced kind of slowly and methodically over time. They take it back to the 1930s and the business leaders responding to the New Deal, to Roosevelt's New Deal. It's called a Christian nation since when? So to regain the upper hand after the New Deal, the business leaders fought back. Not much was working until they began a public relations campaign that connected capitalism, big business, to Christianity. So through Roosevelt's New Deal, the business leaders, corporate leaders, had lost a great deal of power. They tried to campaign and get that power back, but no one wanted to listen to them. So what they realized was that they needed to connect their concepts of capitalism with Christianity. They defined the New Deal as creeping socialism, and throughout the 1930s and 40s, business leaders combined elements of Christianity with their libertarianism. Powerful business lobbies led the way. In a clever decision, these men made clergymen their spokesmen, so they actually employed the most famous of the clergymen to speak on behalf of the businesses. Powerful business lobbies. Polls proved that ministers could mould public opinion more than any other profession, so they recruited clergy through private meetings and public appeals. They begin to introduce prayer breakfasts in US cities designed to bring together business and political elites through prayer. In 1942, a Reverend Abraham Viride persuaded the House and Senate to start weekly prayer meetings in order that we might be a God-directed and God-controlled nation. He opened headquarters in Washington, which he titled God's Embassy. He held dedication ceremonies for several justices of the Supreme Court. The most famous clergyman recruited, you should all know of, Billy Graham. One London paper called him the big business evangelist. It was known at the time. Billy Graham once said that the Garden of Eden was a paradise with no unions, no labour leaders, no snakes, no disease. He attacked all government restrictions in economic affairs using his favourite word, socialism. Billy Graham goes to Washington, he speaks to Congress. He held the first formal religious gathering on the steps of the Capitol. At his urging, Congress established an annual National Day of Prayer. So that is a very quick lead up to the 1950s. You have 1929, the Great Depression. The business leaders are losing power. So what they do is they connect their version of capitalism with Christianity, and they start to employ some of the leading evangelists of the day. Our probably most well-known Billy Graham. So this is all leading up to the 1950s, and in the 1950s you have a national crisis. This one is the Civil War, it's internal. What's happening in the early 1950s, late 1940s that has everyone terrified? Connected?
Civil rights movement and racial unrest.
That's coming back, yes?
Cold War.
The Cold War?
Mad.
Mutually assured destruction. People are afraid of what's coming in. I'm going to just draw it now and hope you can see the logic. I'm going to mark 1948 as the beginning. It's in this history, after 1945, you begin to see people become terrified of socialism. So when you see this fear of socialism within the United States, what are they trying to do? In this history, they're trying to say there's all those immoral, wicked, slave-holding Southerners, God's on our side. In this history, what are they trying to do? There's all those atheistic, communist, socialists, God is on the side of the United States. So they want to make the point before the world that this is a Christian nation and God is on the side of the United States in the Cold War. So 1948, what happens in 1948? This history is primarily introducing the phrase, "In God we trust." But we also see this phrase, "under God." It wasn't officially part of the Pledge of Allegiance. 1948 also, by the way, is the founding of the World Council of Churches. 1948, there's Louis Bowman, an attorney from Illinois. He suggests to the National Society of the Daughters of the American Revolution that they introduce under God when they state the Pledge of Allegiance. They gave him an award of merit for originating that idea. He was a chaplain of the Illinois Society of the Sons of the American Revolution. At a meeting on February 12, 1948, he led the society in reciting the Pledge of Allegiance with 2 words, under God. He said that the words came from Lincoln's Gettysburg Address. Although not all manuscript versions of the Gettysburg Address contain the words under God, all the reporters' transcripts of the speech as Abraham Lincoln delivered it include the words under God. So in 1948, there's this attempt by this chaplain to introduce under God into the Pledge of Allegiance of the Society of the Sons and Daughters of the American Revolution. And what they're particularly trying to do in this history, really from the New Deal, but particularly after the end of World War II, is show that capitalism and Christianity, God, are all on the side of the United States in the Cold War. So under God is introduced into the Society of the Sons and Daughters of the American Revolution. This starts to gain traction. 1951, it's the Knights of Columbus, the world's largest Catholic service organisation. They began including the words under God in the Pledge of Allegiance. In April 30 of 1951, the Board of Directors of the Knights of Columbus adopted a resolution to amend the text of their Pledge of Allegiance at the opening of each of the meeting of the 800 fourth degree assemblies of the Knights of Columbus. They're using under God after the words one nation. Over the next 2 years, the idea spread throughout Knights of Columbus organisations nationwide. On August 21, 1952, the Supreme Council of the Knights of Columbus at its annual meeting adopted a resolution urging that the change be made universal, and copies of this resolution were sent to the President and the Vice President and the Speaker of the House of Representatives. So they've taken this phrase, they've introduced it into their own organisation, and now they're pushing the US government. At the suggestion of a correspondent, a representative, Louis Rabieu of Michigan, sponsored a resolution to add the words into the Pledge of Allegiance. February 1954. No prior endeavour to get the pledge officially amended had succeeded. The final successful push came from George McPherson Doherty. Some American presidents honoured Lincoln's birthday by attending services at the church Lincoln attended, New York Avenue Presbyterian Church, by sitting in Lincoln's pew on the Sunday nearest February 12. February 7, 1954, with President Eisenhower sitting in Lincoln's pew, the church's pastor, George Doherty, delivered a sermon based on the Gettysburg Address entitled A New Birth of Freedom. He argued that the nation's might lay not in arms, but rather in its spirit and higher purpose. He noted that the pledge's sentiments could be those of any nation. There's something missing in the US Pledge of Allegiance, and that which was missing was a characteristic and definitive factor in the American way of life, quoting him. He cited Lincoln's words under God as defining words that set the US apart from other nations. So to honour Lincoln's birthday, President Eisenhower is in Lincoln's church, sitting in Lincoln's pew, and the sermon of the day by Pastor Doherty is that Gettysburg Address, entitled A New Birth of Freedom, introduced the words under God, and that the US Pledge of Allegiance, as it currently would, did not represent the nation because it did not introduce the concept of the nation as under God, the definitive factor in the American way of life. And I don't know how much you know of President Eisenhower, but he was a strong Christian. He had just been baptized a Presbyterian. I think that was directly after his election. He responded enthusiastically in a conversation following the service to Doherty's suggestion. The very next day, February 8, 1954, a bill was introduced into Congress. Congress passed the necessary legislation, and Eisenhower signed the bill into law on Flag Day, June 14, 1954. Quoting Eisenhower, "From this day forward, the millions of our school children will daily proclaim in every city and town, every village and rural schoolhouse, the dedication of our nation and our people to the Almighty. In this way, we are reaffirming the transcendence of religious faith in America's heritage and future. In this way, we shall constantly strengthen those spiritual weapons which forever will be our country's most powerful resource in peace or in war." And "under God" is officially added to the Pledge of Allegiance. So this history is the call to come up with a religious inscription, and that inscription is "In God We Trust." It's formed in 1863. It's stamped and made official in 64 and 65. 1948, it's a call to change the Pledge of Allegiance. It's "Under God." 1951, it's introduced by the Knights of Columbus, and they start lobbying the government. 1954, "Under God" is officially added to the Pledge of Allegiance. These things that seem so normal about Christianity in America, they're not that old comparatively. It was never meant to be that way from the start. On October 6, 1954, the National Executive Committee of the American Legion adopted a resolution, first approved by the American Legion Convention in August, which formally recognized the Knights of Columbus for having initiated and brought forward the amendment to the Pledge of Allegiance. So despite the sermon in 1954, they credit the Knights of Columbus with being the ones that had pushed this through the government. The insertion of the phrase was influenced by the pushback against Russian atheistic communism during the Cold War. I just want to quote, from a website, Vision, Philosophy, Ideas of the Meaning of "In God We Trust." In the early 1950s, after the Soviet Union had successfully tested an atomic weapon, they tested that atomic weapon 1949, first successful test by the Soviet Union, the Cold War escalated. Many perceived the heightened fear of potential nuclear holocaust as a battle between godless communism and God-fearing America. It's the same fear that they had up here. It's the godless Southerners with the God-fearing Northerners. Now it's godless communism with God-fearing America. Once again, religious sentiment played a significant role as the United States House of Representatives introduced a resolution to adopt the phrase as America's national motto. In a PBS documentary series titled "God in America," history professor Frank Lambert remarks, "It was in that environment, with this Cold War, that Congress decided that 'In God We Trust' should be the new motto." This is 1956. They don't stop here. 1956 is 63 years to what year? They bring back the phrase "In God We Trust." Here it's just stamped on your coins. In 1956, in all of the fear of the Cold War and potential annihilation at any moment with a nuclear weapon, they introduced the "In God We Trust" and make it the official motto of the United States. It was in this environment that Congress decided that "In God We Trust" should be the new motto, reclaiming the notion that we're a chosen people, that we were conceived under God, and that we flourish under God. We turn our backs on God at our own peril. So in 1956, Dwight D. Eisenhower signed into law a bill declaring "In God We Trust" to become the nation's official motto. What was the motto before this? Can't speak Latin, but e pluribus unum. What does that mean? Out of many, one. So, many states, one nation. Really, it's a beautiful motto. Couldn't you say many religions, one nation? Or many cultures? One people? Out of many? Black, white, male, female, Muslim, Protestant? Out of many, one. It's the perfect motto, but they rejected it. So they reject the motto, out of many, one, and they choose the phrase, in God we trust. What time do we finish? 9:45. Okay. 9/11, what happens? What happens to America? Now who's the threat? 9/11, Islam strikes. And how does Protestant America respond? In post 9/11 America, evangelical preachers gleefully whipped up the flames of Islamophobia and blamed the attack on America's decadent acceptance of feminism and homosexuality. I want to quote a number of evangelical leaders in the history of 9/11. This is Anna Graham Lotz. Who's Anna Graham Lotz? Billy Graham's daughter. She says, our nation seems to be shaking its fist in God's face. We're abandoning God as a nation, she continued. What happens then is God abandons us and backs away. He takes his favour and blessing away from us. I think that's why God allows bad things to happen. I think that's why he would allow 9/11 to happen, or the dreadful attack in San Bernardino, to show us that we need him. Her brother, Franklin Graham, founder of the charity Samaritan's Purse, has previously accused President Barack Obama of spreading immorality, while praising Vladimir Putin, the Russian president, of instituting a ban on gay propaganda. This is the problem that the religious right have. Who's their hero? It's actually Vladimir Putin. He has been so moral in how he rules his nation. Anne Graham Lotz, the daughter of famed evangelist Billy Graham, appeared on Steve Deese's radio show to remind listeners that God has forsaken the US because of transgender, the teaching of evolution, gays, etc. She said that she hoped some of this craziness would settle down in the United States, which according to her seems to be shaking its fist in God's face and telling him to get out of our politics, get out of our schools, get out of our businesses, get out of our marketplaces, get off the streets. So she says that the nation is under the judgment of God because of immoral people and because we have removed God from our politics, schools, businesses, marketplace, streets. If you've read the writings of A.T. Jones, what right does the US politics have to include God? No right. But this is who the Protestants are blaming for the attack of 9/11. She says, if Americans were to repent, God would begin to reveal the plots of terrorists before they are carried out, even the weather patterns he can control and protect us from violent storms. Her brother, Franklin Graham, had previously called on Americans to boycott businesses that supported gay people. He had also accused Mr. Obama of spreading immorality and sin and praised Vladimir Putin. So, what's their narrative? It's evidence that God has backed away from the United States because the United States is supposed to be a Christian nation. It's removed God from its politics, and there's rampant immorality. That's the Protestant tradition. So what does ours have to be? Why is the United States under the judgment of God? Jerry Falwell and Pat Robinson. You may know the name Jerry Falwell. He's very influential. After 9/11, they said that God had allowed the terrorists to succeed in their deadly mission because the United States had become a nation of abortion, homosexuality, secular schools and courts, and the American Civil Liberties Union. Mr. Falwell said on Thursday while being interviewed by the 700 Club, "What we saw on Tuesday, as terrible as it is, could be minuscule if, in fact, God continues to lift the curtain and allow the enemies of America to give us probably what we deserve." Mr. Robertson responded, "Jerry, that's my feeling. I think we've just begun to see the antechamber to terror. We haven't even begun to see what they can do to the major population." Jerry Falwell responds, "The abortionists have got to bear some burden for this because God will not be mocked. We make God mad. I believe the pagans, the abortionists, the feminists, the gays and the lesbians who are actively trying to make that an alternative lifestyle, the ACLU, People for the American Way, all of them who have tried to make America secular, I point the finger in their face and say, you helped this happen." To which Mr. Robertson said, "I totally concur, and the problem is we have adopted that agenda at the highest levels of our government. So who's to blame for immorality?" The government. Because what is the government supposed to be? It's supposed to be Christian, Protestant, and it's supposed to enforce morality. So they have the exact same stream of information after 9/11 that the Protestant churches had after 1861. And it hasn't stopped here, it's continued through. The cyclone that hit New Orleans, what did they say? Judgment of God, because there was going to be a gay pride march. And some in this movement taught the same thing. It's interesting that when a cyclone hits Florida, they go quiet. Suddenly it doesn't work anymore. Despite overwhelming evidence that supports climate change is a factor in the devastating storm and subsequent flooding of Hurricane Harvey, a handful of evangelical leaders have suggested that the LGBT community are to blame. Minister Kevin Swanson, famous minister, said Houston had sinned by having a very, very aggressively pro-homosexual mayor. Jesus sends the message home: unless Americans repent, unless Houston repents, unless New Orleans repent, they will all likewise perish. This is the message that the Lord Jesus Christ is sending home right now to America. It's interesting that there was actually one lady, evangelical lady, that said that there was a drought. I think might have been somewhere in Texas, that there was a drought in Texas because of this homosexual mayor that had been elected. The day he was elected, it poured. She went quiet. 2001, what begins to happen in Mississippi? Mississippi all starts here. And now it's being introduced into classrooms all across America. It begins in 2001 in Mississippi, April 4. No state but Mississippi had passed such a law. All public schools should post "In God We Trust" in every classroom, auditorium and cafeteria. Governor Ronnie Musgrove says, "Our nation was founded as a godly nation and we must put it on our money." So "In God We Trust" comes into history at 9/11 and they begin to push it again. This is prior to 9/11, but after 9/11 what happens? They encourage people, do it on your home computers, print "In God We Trust," put it everywhere. It was put in business windows, in schools, on the sides of cars, in car windows, everywhere they could put this phrase, they started to put "In God We Trust." So 9/11 really gives it the leverage. It started in April, but 9/11 gives it the leverage it needed to take off. Musgrove said, "Our nation was founded as a godly nation and we already put it on our money. So the excuse being used here, people are saying this is a violation of church and state. The excuse is it's already our national motto and it's already on our coins. So they use these two histories as an excuse to start pushing it again. Just consider, prior to 2014, in this lead up, from 2008, what side's winning? Democrats. I want to make an application, just a suggestion. We see the ship start in 1798, it's on its journey. 1863, what happens? It goes off course. If we were to take that history, and we see it as a one long history, we can do that. If we were to cut it and bring it down into this history, what's happening under Obama? Is the nation on course or off course? It's on course. The United States was on course under Obama. I want you to consider how Obama treated these phrases. November of 2010, Obama states the national motto. He has to state the national motto. What does he say? He gets attacked for this by the churches. He says, e pluribus unum. He will not say, in God we trust. So Obama goes back to using the Latin phrase, out of many one. And can you imagine the responses of the churches? There's a website called War Builders. They list all the reasons why Obama waged a war on religion, which is what they called it. All the reasons that the evangelicals really started to become hostile to him. And this is one of the instances. He referred to the national motto as out of many one. November 19, 2013 was the 150-year anniversary of the Gettysburg Address. Abraham Lincoln recited the Gettysburg Address 150 years ago in 2013. And to celebrate its commemoration, President Obama did a speech and he recited the Pledge of Allegiance. Did he include the words under God? No. No. He would not include the words under God to the Pledge of Allegiance. How does he stand on under God and in God we trust? Separation of church and state. He had it right. But it's one of the reasons the evangelicals start to turn against him and really fight. They can see they're losing this war under Obama. This marks the turning point. So if we had have had time this week, we would have gone into 2014, Steve Bannon, Cambridge Analytica. You have the Republican donors start to fund this work. They're trying to find what the catalyst needs to be to overturn the government and bring in a Republican. I just want to quote Steve Bannon. 2014, he's having a conference at the Vatican. He warns his Christian audience. He says, we're at the very beginning stages of a brutal and bloody conflict. We are in an outright war against jihadists, Islam, Islamic fascism. He condemns the immense secularization of the West. What's his problem? We're too secular. We need to get back to our Christian roots. He stresses that the people in this room and the people in the church must bind together and really form what I feel is an aspect of the church militant. He uses all of our language. He wants the church militant to really be able to not just stand with our beliefs, but to fight for our beliefs against this new barbarity that's starting. In his speech, Bannon articulated a view of the world as a constant conflict between capitalist, Jewish, Christian West, which is a benevolent force of enlightenment, and the forces of socialism, atheism, and Islam. So in this history, it's the South. In this history, it's the Soviet Union, communism. In this history, it's particularly Islam. But they all see their nation as under the judgment of God, and the only safety is in declaring the United States to be a Christian nation. I want to suggest that what starts in 2014 is made official in 2015, is a movement that can be called the Make America Great Again movement. What's the foundation of that phrase? What are they saying?
Be selfish.
Where before did we see a movement?
Ronald Reagan used the same phrase.
He did. We want to go back to Reagan. That's why this goes back so long. But that's important. Up here we have a national reform movement. What does it mean to reform? If you reform something, what are you doing to it? Going back to the original. So there's been something, Christian nation, you're going to reform it. Because what's happened? If we were to consider the national reform movement, I want to suggest nationalism. Reform. Great again. This movement that begins in 2014, that leads to Donald Trump in 2015, his election in 2016, and everything that's happened since, is a repeat of the national reform movement. They're the same movement and they have the same agenda. Both are seeing the United States for what it is. Both are wanting to reform it, to turn it around to something that they think it was before. Are they right in what they think it was before? No, they're wrong. They have a wrong concept of what their nation was created to be, of the Constitution. And it's nationalistic at its core. In 2014, the head of the Congressional Prayer Caucus Foundation, Lee Carawan, she stated, "The separation of church and state is a liberal plan to ruin America, and it will be the death knell of our nation." We need to remember her name. She comes up in further history. She says, "This is the death knell of our nation, separation of church and state. If the Church of God, if the Christians, do not engage in the public square and do not see that as their responsibility, their right and responsibility, then those that do not believe like us will absolutely fill the void. And what people don't understand is that every nation will reflect somebody's values. And up until now, it's Jewish Christian values, because the Christians have held to it and they've protected it every single generation. But if we do not protect it in our generation, if we back down, we're going to lose it. The threat is real." So she's saying every generation has defended the United States as a Christian nation. The idea of separation of church and state is going to destroy the United States. What did A.T. Jones say? I want to go to a couple of A.T. Jones quotes. I won't read the references because they're long. I'll give these out to whoever wants them. But he has so many good quotes. This is A.T. Jones. He says, "When the papacy was formed and the power of the empire was seized upon by the professed Christian church, just as these people are now trying to do," he's talking about the national reform movement, "to protect the day and the things generally considered holy, there was again introduced the spirit of persecution and the principles which produced the Dark Ages and the fearful despotism that ruled in those ages." So what began the rise of the papacy? A fear that they needed to protect what they considered to be holy. It's protectionism. When the Reformation came, again holding before the world the true ideas of holiness and of holy things as announced by Jesus, the persecutions which were inflicted upon those who chose to disregard the governmental idea of holiness and holy things outdid by far the persecutions which pagan Rome had inflicted at the first upon those who chose to decide for themselves before God what was required of them in the matter of holiness and holy things. And our fathers who framed this new nation, seeing the long course of oppression, marked by a steady stream of blood in the attempts of government to protect things and institutions generally considered holy, decided that this government should be cursed with any such thing, and therefore declared that no religious test shall ever be required as qualification to any office of public trust under this government, and that Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. And so they rightly decided to leave holy things to themselves and to protect themselves. Yet how fast this wicked principle of majority rule in matters of religion and the conscience is growing. But this question is not a question of majorities or minorities, for if the conscience of the majority is to be the standard, then there is no such thing as right of conscience at all. It is against the predominance and the power of majorities that the rights of conscience are protected and have need to be protected. And those who call themselves Protestants are not the only people in the world who have a conscience. I love the way A.T. Jones speaks. He has power. So 1979, what's formed? We covered this. 1979, it's the moral majority. This is the 10 years of Jerry Falwell and the moral majority. What are they saying just in their name?
They're the majority and they're moral.
What they stated clearly was that we are in the majority is moral, and therefore the morals of the majority must be enforced. And their first victory was getting Ronald Reagan into office. And what does A.T. Jones say? It is against the predominance and power of majorities that the rights of conscience are protected. The Protestants in this history, even the Christians in this history, are not the only ones who have a conscience. 2019 marks the end of the Civil War, the establishment of a dictator, and you can see that on many lines that we're not going into today. It's the breakdown of republicanism. But I want us to think and review what's happening right now. We've gone back to the moral majority, which we've already introduced before. I want us to consider its origins. This is from the New Yorker. It's a magazine. This title of this article is Church and State. They're talking about Jerry Falwell. In the 70s, Falwell brought together a group of fundamentalist pastors who had independent churches to discuss what should be done with the course of their nation. Then in the late 70s and early 80s, he preached that Christians, by which he means evangelical Christians, should engage in the world and save America from moral decline and secularism. He essentially said, look, we've made this false distinction between sacred and secular. Everything is sacred. We've left business to Wall Street and politics to Washington. So they begin to try and bring together secular and sacred. We already started to hint at it, but I want us to look at it in a little more detail. Why he really brought about the moral majority. In 1974, the Internal Revenue Service, their IRS tax department, moved to revoke the tax-exempt status of Bob Jones University. Why?
501.
I don't know what 501 is. They didn't want to keep the tax-exempt status of the universities. Why?
It's a religious university.
They don't mind the religious university aspect. What are the religious universities doing?
Getting tax exemption.
What side of the civil rights movement are the religious universities standing on? The wrong side of the civil rights movement. And Bob Jones University forbade interracial dating. They had even denied entry to black people since 1971. You were not allowed to attend that university if you were black. This decision infuriated Falwell. He wanted to keep the tax-exempt status and still allow segregation. What brought Falwell and other white evangelicals into a common cause in the late 1970s was this interference by the IRS. They brought about a ruling that stripped tax-exempt status from all white private schools formed in the South in reaction to Brown versus Board of Education Supreme Court ruling to desegregate public schools. Falwell had founded one of these schools in Lynchburg, though he and other white evangelicals insisted that their schools were Christian academies, not segregation academies. In one fell swoop, writes Corey Robin, the heirs of slaveholders became the descendants of persecuted Baptists, and Jim Crow a heresy the First Amendment was meant to protect. In this controversy, the religious right found its voice and its power, and it was the common cause that brought these different universities and evangelicals together. So right at the very beginning, what's the issues? Racism. In the decades following World War II, evangelicals, especially white evangelicals in the North, had drifted towards the Republican Party, inclined in that direction by general Cold War anxiety, suspicions of Catholicism, and the work of Billy Graham. Billy Graham's friendship with Eisenhower and Nixon. Despite these issues, evangelicals had largely stayed out of politics, at least in any organised way. This is quoting from Paul Weyrich. He's the late religious conservative, political activist, co-founder of the Heritage Foundation. Paul Weyrich said, "We must have a new political philosophy that must be defined by us, conservatives, in moral terms, packaged in non-religious language, and propagated throughout the country by a new coalition." He said that in the mid-1970s. "When political power is achieved, the moral majority will have the opportunity to recreate this great nation. The leadership, moral philosophy, and workable vehicle are at hand, just waiting to be blended and activated. If the moral majority acts, results could well exceed our wildest dreams." This is before they actually formed the moral majority organisation. This is what leads to it. This desire for a new political philosophy to recreate the United States. Bob Jones University, 1970s. The IRS sent it its first letter to ascertain whether or not it discriminated on the basis of race. The school responded defiantly. It did not admit African Americans. Through Bob Jones Jr., the school's founder argued that racial segregation is mandated by the Bible. Do they have the same book we have? And the same constitution? What's their problem? Interpretation. Falwell and Weyrich quickly sought to shift the grounds of the debate, framing their opposition in terms of religious freedom rather than in defence of racial segregation. For decades, evangelical leaders had boasted that because their educational institutions accepted no federal money, except for tax exemption, the government could not tell them how to run their shops, whom to hire, whom to admit or reject. The Civil Rights Act changed that. So they have the same work that we have. And what argument are they making? It goes against my religious freedom to allow an African American to attend the same school. They're arguing that they're defending their religious freedom. It's the same argument I believe Brother Tyler addressed that made in the Civil War. It's my religious freedom to own slaves. Coming down here, it's my religious freedom to not have to bake a cake for a gay couple getting married. They're framing everything in the terms that they're protecting their religious freedom. Bob Jones University did try to placate the IRS. Following the initial inquiries into their racial policies, Bob Jones admitted one African American, a worker in its radio station, as a part-time student. He only lasted 1 month. You can imagine the environment wouldn't have been easy. In 1975, again in an attempt to forestall IRS action, the school admitted blacks to the student body. But they refused to admit unmarried African Americans because they were so afraid that there would be interracial marriage. So you can see this issue of racism. It's that conflict with the IRS that starts to bring all these universities and evangelicals together. And in 1979, they choose this phrase of the moral majority, that they want to reform their nation, and they form it into a society that starts in 1979 and ends in 1989. It's dissolved in 1989. In 1978, secular New Right leaders, I think that's an organisation, they approached Falwell and offered their backing if he would use his schools to head a national political organisation that would link conservative evangelicals to the Republican Party. Who are they beginning to work with?
State.
Which part of the state? The Republican Party. We should have known this in 2016. We don't know it's Donald Trump just because he's wealthy, and Daniel 11 says the king's wealthy. That's not the basis. 1978, who are they aligning with? The Republican Party, and it's Reagan, and it's George Bush, and it's Donald Trump. 1989, 9/11, 2019. This is all happening under Republicans. Falwell agreed and he formed his moral majority, relying primarily on his connections with fellow pastors. They then became the face of the Christian right movement in America. He described their mission as being the agent to train, mobilize, and electrify the religious right. At a speech at his own church in Lynchburg, Virginia in 1980, he described their enemy. We are, quoting him, "We are fighting a holy war. What's happening to America is that the wicked are bearing rule. We have to lead the nation back to the moral stance that made America great again. We need to wield influence on those who govern us. We need to wield political power. We need to make America great again." It's the same phrasing. The moral majority was credited with delivering 2/3 of the white evangelical Christian vote to Ronald Reagan in the 1980 election. According to Jimmy Carter, that autumn 1980, a group headed by Jerry Falwell purchased $10 million in commercials on Southern radio and TV to brand me, Jimmy Carter, as a traitor to the South and no longer a Christian. What are they attacking Jimmy Carter with? He's not Christian enough. He's a traitor to the South. During his time as head of the moral majority, Falwell consistently pushed for Republican candidates and conservative politics. In 1989, Falwell proclaimed, "Our mission is accomplished." Why is it accomplished? Because it's time of the end and there's no going back. You have Ronald Reagan and George Bush. So they have no problem in dissolving the society in 1989. Falwell said in announcing that he was disbanding the moral majority in 1989, quote, "I feel that I have performed the task to which I was called in 1979. The religious right is solidly in place." 1989, who's solidly in place? Republican Party and the religious right. Like the galvanizing of the black church as a political force a generation ago, the religious conservatives in America are now in for the duration. In 1989, the moral majority ends and you have the beginning of what was known as the Christian Coalition. So the attempt does not end. Continues throughout this history. 1989 takes you to 9/11, and then what happens? 9/11, Islam hits, and we come back to our story that we'd started with in repeating these histories. The judgment of God because of immorality. 1990, I just want to note, this fellow, Jerry Falwell, when you come down to the history of 1994, what does he put together? The Clinton Chronicles. He was the author of the Clinton Chronicles. If he was attacking Jimmy Carter to stop Jimmy Carter challenging Ronald Reagan, who's he attacking in 1994? Clinton. This is, sorry you can't see so easy. The film was directed by a man, can't say his name, I'm just going to say his first name, Patrick Matriciana, I think it is. Matriciana. He had a production company called Jeremiah Films. The production was credited to Citizens for Honest Government. To promote the film, Falwell aired an interview with Matriciana, who was silhouetted to conceal his identity, and he pretended to be a journalist who was afraid for his life. So just even in the promotion of this film, it's all about deception. Jerry Falwell, to promote it, conducts an interview with Matriciana, but he's silhouetted so you can't see who he is. Matriciana was the director, and Matriciana fakes his identity, pretending to be a journalist who's afraid for his life because apparently the Clintons are killing people. It was entirely based on deception. Matriciana acknowledged that he was not in any danger or a journalist. The whole thing was staged. So this is also happening under Jerry Falwell. He's still protecting the religious right through this history. And in this history, 2015, 2016, who's the first leading evangelical to support Donald Trump? He leads all the others. Jerry Falwell Jr. It's his son. It's Jerry Falwell Jr. that tweeted, I think a couple months ago now, that Donald Trump should be allowed a 6-year term because those Democrats and the Russia investigation have just held him back, restrained him for 2 years, ruined 2 years of his presidency. They are, more than anyone else, but a great deal of the evangelicals are behind him. In 2016, we come to the election. I want to read a quote from Time magazine. It's talking about Donald Trump's election. He's just won. He's just won. In the dark hours of early Wednesday morning, moments after Donald Trump gave his victory speech to a cheering ballroom in New York, the president-elect paused backstage with one Pentecostal pastor. I want to list names we should look up. Her name is Paula White. She's backstage. Donald Trump pauses with Paula White. With Vice President-elect Mike Pence and their families nearby, White prayed over them, asking God to guide them in wisdom and protect them in the days ahead. Just days earlier, White was traveling with Trump on his plane when he brought up how Harry Truman surprised everyone by winning against Thomas Dewey in 1948. Now Trump prepares to enter the White House after an upset of his own. For Paula White, quoting her, God's hand and purpose is in this. Thousands of Christians, she says, joined her in 3 days of prayer and fasting in anticipation of the outcome. She says, I haven't personally seen this coming together of the body of Christianity since when? Since 9/11. So in this history, 2015, 2016, I don't find it a coincidence that Donald Trump gets 81% of the evangelical Christian vote. I'm going to paraphrase one quote from the New York Times, and then we'll close in a prayer and come back. It's 1 month before the midterm elections last year, so what month is it? October 2018. What's October 2018 internally? The same time we're doing what we're doing, there's 1,000 theatres in the United States screening a film called The Trump Prophecy. It's a film that tells the story of Mark Taylor, a former firefighter, who claims that God told him in 2011 that Donald Trump would be elected president. So at the same time we're formalizing our message, what do they have? 1,000 theatres in the United States saying that Donald Trump is a fulfillment of prophecy. And they're using the same prophecies that we are. What go to? This Mark Taylor, this firefighter that they're telling the story of, in 2011 they claim that he collapsed in a flashing light of epiphany. He picked up a Bible and it turns to the 45th chapter of the book of Isaiah. Where do we go to understand the 45th president? The 45th chapter of the book of Isaiah, which describes the anointing of King Cyrus by God. In the next scene, we hear Mr. Trump being interviewed on the 700 Club, a popular Christian television show. Lance Volney, an evangelical author and speaker who appears in the film, once said, I believe the 45th president is meant to be an Isaiah 45 Cyrus, who will restore the crumbling walls that separate us from cultural collapse. Do they have prophecy behind their message? The same prophecies. Then this is the New York Times. They go through they're saying this to an ethnonym, so they have to explain who Cyrus is. They go through 6th century BC, the first emperor of Persia, celebrates Cyrus, he frees the Jews, he was held captive, and then they also give the mentality behind it. Cyrus is the model for a non-believer appointed by God as a vessel for the purposes of the faithful. Was Cyrus a Christian? So why do they care about Trump's immorality? They don't, because they don't need someone moral, they just need a Cyrus. The identification of the 45th president with an ancient Middle Eastern potentate isn't a fringe thing. The Trump prophecy was produced with the help of professors and students at Liberty University. Who started Liberty University? Jerry Falwell. Jerry Falwell Jr. was the instrument in rallying evangelical support for Mr. Trump. Janine Pirro, where does she speak through? One of the main speakers through Fox News picks up on the theme. Fox News is sending out this thought. The Israeli ambassador to the United States, many others, they all say that Donald Trump was raised up by God and is raised up as a king. Paula White, it is God that raises up a king. Ralph Drollinger, who has led weekly Bible study groups in the White House attended by Mike Pence and other cabinet members, likes the word king so much that he frequently turns it into a verb. Get ready to king in our future lives, he tells his followers. Christian believers, quoting, Christian believers will, soon I hope, become the consummate, perfect, governing authorities. Who governs? Christian believers. The great thing about kings like Cyrus, this is New York Times again, as far as today's Christian nationalists are concerned, is that they don't have to follow rules. They are the law. This makes them ideal leaders in paranoid times. Another important thing to understand about Cyrus, and this is where the New York Times starts bringing in another thought. What they also like about Cyrus. What is it about Cyrus that they also like, that they're wanting? That's an issue in 2016. Cyrus isn't a queen. In the Christian nationalist world, legitimate political power is male. Mr. Drollinger insists, this is the White House speaker, the Bible only allows male leadership. Why can't they unite behind Clinton? Cyrus isn't a queen. Only male leadership. This isn't the religious right we thought we knew. The Christian nationalist movement is authoritarian, paranoid, and patriarchal at its core. They aren't fighting a culture war, they're making a direct attack on democracy itself. They want it all, and in Mr. Trump they have found a man who does not merely serve their cause, but also satisfies their craving for a certain kind of political leadership. A king, a dictator. If you'll kneel with me, we'll close in prayer and we'll finish up in our next. Dear Father in heaven, thank you, Lord, for your truth. Thank you, Lord, that we compare and contrast the right and the wrong, and we can see that all that we look at, the ugliness of what is happening under the Christian right, the lack of tolerance and acceptance, Father, that is the direct opposite of who you are. I pray that in these studies, as we look at the work of Satan, as we look at the counterfeit, that we'll have a better understanding of the true, that we will compare and contrast and see your beauty and your holiness, that your love for people is not even mildly dependent on their colour or their gender or anything about them, Father, rather than the fact that we're your sons and daughters. I pray that we'll see each other in that light, that we'll come on the right side of these issues. I pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.